Hi, this is Debbie Davis for Outlier Legal, and we're here today to talk about documents and specifically Canadian documents. For some of you that had joined us before a few weeks ago, we talked in general about documents, but not the specific in and outs that are required to actually help the Canadians with their Canadian documents for immigration. We're super excited that you're here today with us because we want everybody to understand and learn exactly what they need, so it helps you when you're trying to do your immigration. Today we have some experts with us. The first one I'll introduce, at this point, I don't know if he needs an introduction. Alfredo Abrego, he's the lead immigration manager for Outlier Legal. And he's here with us today to be able to answer any questions where documents might relate to directly to any of the immigration. Alfredo, thanks so much for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me once again, Debbie. I think we're ready in this webinar for live, so I'm very glad to participate in each of the webinars that we are doing to help those expats to have a clear information and so that they can actually do a well-informed decision once they're planning to move here.
Right. Yeah. And you just do such a super job of explaining it. You know, we've had nothing but positive comments about you and your answers to all the questions and helping people. So it's really great again that you were able to come. We also have Amanda Bolton, who you guys met if you came to the actual documents webinar that we had a few weeks ago that talked about in general about all the documents. So she's here again. Amanda, thanks so much for coming.
Hi, I'm always happy to be present when we're talking about documents. I feel like sometimes documents get lost in the shuffle when we're talking about legal processes, whether that's immigration or business or real estate. And in all of them, documents are required. So I'm happy to jump on and provide any information that we can.
Yeah, that's kind of your stick, right? All documents, all day, all the time.
That's right.
Right? And if I remember it before, you're from the big state of Texas.
That's right. I moved from the US to Costa Rica 10 years ago. I wanted to study Spanish, and I met Tico Boy, who's now my husband of almost 9 years. Wow. And I'm super smitten with the country, and I just left education after 10 years of being a teacher, and I've come over to the world of expats, and I love it. And we are expats helping expats, so I have some understanding of what they're going through. I've learned so much recently about Canadian documents. We have had such a great experience this year, a big learning curve, understanding what workarounds we might be able to find for Canadians. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I'm happy to be here and accompanied by my awesome teammates.
Yes, could you introduce?
Happily,
yes. With you? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so first of all, I'll introduce Melissa DiNardo. She's coming from Canada. I messed with her and I said, we need your Canadian accent on this show, come on over. But really, she has been very active in researching and finding ways to expedite certain processes, finding out all the tiny details, province specific. She's made phone calls to embassies and we've researched together. So she's really done her homework. I'm super glad to have her here. And that's Melissa DiNardo. And then we also, go ahead, Melissa, say hi.
Hi, everyone. Some of you might have met me talking and calling Outlier Legal because I am one of the case account managers helping new people come in. So it's nice to really understand the Canadian process because Canada makes it a lot harder because I'm not part of the Hague, and we'll get into that. But it's really nice to have this webinar and be invited to join all of you on this webinar to really understand what makes Canada great.
Great. Thanks for being here,
great. Thanks, Melissa.
We also have as chat assistants here, Jia Wu, who is our most senior documents coordinator. He's residing in Costa Rica currently, and will be assisting question and answers in the chat. So go ahead and wave hello, Jia. And then we'll hand it back to you, Debbie. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome, guys. I'm super happy to have you here today. And let's just kind of like jump right into it, Amanda. So can you kind of tell everybody, like, what does your documents, OLS documents, do? What kind of documents do they procure? And just a little snippet about that process?
Sure. So we procure very few documents from Canada because they have very strict rules about who can do the procurement. So when we're talking about obtaining or procuring the document, what we can procure is generally the RCMP.
Okay.
However, as we've talked about in previous webinars, all documents that come from outside of the country of destination need to be authenticated or legalized for use. And so what we do in addition to procurement of RCMPs is that we can legalize and authenticate the Canadian documents that are needed. And those include the RCMPs and also vital records like birth certificates, marriage certificates, divorce, pension letters. So while we can't procure the latter, we can only procure RCMP at this point. We do help authenticate and legalize the others.
And that's really where it gets sticky, doesn't it? It's that, a person can order, online their birth certificate or however other ways they can get them in Canada. But after that, that's where it really gets deep. Isn't that right? Isn't that where the problems come in for people?
Correct. Well, to start off with, the RCMP is not easy either. If we compare the RCMP, which is the background check comparable to, say, an FBI police report for people who are immigrating from the United States. We have to do ink prints. We have a very involved process becoming either associated with a provider or becoming qualified ourselves to be able to communicate with the RCMP. So they don't make that step easy either. For example, in the UK, their background check is called an ACRO, and they don't even require fingerprints at all.
Oh.
So they make it a lot easier in some other countries. Canadians are quite strict with what they will accept and who they will communicate with. So outside of that, then we get to the authentication and legalization process. And to compare that to legalization of other countries, like what Melissa was mentioning, we look at the Hague Convention, which has been around since the 50s. It has over 90 countries. So when we say the majority of our clients, I mean, really almost all of the other countries that we receive immigrants from are part of the Hague Convention. So this puts Canada in a really kind of a painful place for Canadians who are trying to comply with immigration rules, because as Alfredo has mentioned in other webinars, and we talked about in documents, these have like a very short shelf life. So they can only be in process for a few months before we need them to appear in front of the judge or the immigration case.
Well,
so,
if I could for just a second, Amanda, I was thinking that we're talking about all these documents, and maybe we should just jump to Alfredo for a minute. Alfredo, these documents, could you kind of clear up for people who might be listening today that don't really understand, since you have to do this on the immigration side, right? How are these documents used, or why is it such a sticky wicket to make sure the documents, are authenticated and able to be used with immigration?
Okay, sure. Well, basically, these documents are requested because according to the law, or at least they have a sense on why immigration actually requests them. If you take into consideration, they request basically the birth certificate to know that you are who you say you actually are, right? Just so that you don't have any double identity or something like that may cause any issues for anybody else. A second is, well, the background check that Amanda was mentioning, in this case, the RCMPs, basically is just to prove that you're not going to be any kind of danger, or you're not going to affect the national security of Costa Rica. That's a big thing here in Costa Rica, and that's something that is one of the most important documents regarding the immigration process, or even the naturalization process if you're doing a naturalization with the TSE here. And well, the marriage certificate basically is just to prove that you actually have a direct link with the person that you're going to apply as a dependent, basically. So that's like the sense that immigration gives to these documents, so that they can prove all these things and say that you actually are who you are. You're not going to be any danger to the country, and that you actually have a link. Or in the case of the marriage, that also helps to actually prove in case you have had any name change.
Right. And then also with the different categories, there's some different things needed. And in Canada, if you're applying for the pensionado residency, they're going to have a document they're going to need for that as well, correct?
Yes, exactly. Basically, at least for these three documents, it's basically the same for all three categories. Basically, the pensionado, rentista, investor, that are like the most common category that we usually receive clients from. But yes, at least for the pension category, I have had work with some pensionados from Canada. To be honest, it's a little bit difficult to actually receive a pension letter from Canada itself. And the whole legalization process is quite a mess. So sometimes there's people who actually receive pension. I forgot actually the name of the entity that is basically the equal to the Social Security in the States, but that those documents usually do have some kind of the exact language that is to receive a stable, permanent monthly pension of $1,000 per month, basically. But most of the pensions in Canada does not have this exact wording that is the one that is accepted by immigration.
Right. And so they can also, you know, whether they're getting like I think it's maybe they refer to, well, it's like Social Security here. So I think they might call that old age. But then some people also have a pension, and they can use that document as well, as long as it has the proper language. Is that right?
Yes, basically there is also pensions that actually are from not the government side, but they have a private, basically a private institution that also helps them to receive any kind of pension based on savings or something like that. If they actually get that to have the exact wording, that can be totally used. The only problem is that if it is a private institution, that pension letter must be notarized by a public notary, and then it has to be legalized.
Right. So then that document would go through OLS Documents as well as to do the process that Amanda was talking to us about. So Amanda, if you could then kind of tell us a little bit, you've touched on this and we've talked about the documents a little bit, but there's some real nuances in Canada as far as like the type of birth certificate that's required, you know, where you can get it, how you can get it, you know, can you talk a little bit about that so people understand? Because it's quite confusing if you ask me.
Yeah, absolutely it is. This is where the learning curve has been very steep. I wanted to mention what you were talking about previously with Alfredo, and then we'll of course share the vital records as well. Working together with Melissa, we put together a few examples. So if I may share my screen, and then Melissa and we can talk about a couple of some real life examples.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Could I mention something before we go into the examples? When Alfredo was talking about the pension letters, we have the Ontario Disability, like the ODS pension, and then the Canadian pension plan. Both of them are not really providing the exact verbiage that we're needing in order to be accepted by immigrations. So we are getting a lot of success just from the private pensions that people are receiving on their own, whether it's through a union or through their other employers. Just want to give those exact names.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Melissa. So yes, on exactly along the same lines, we have this client here who did procure their own pension letter through the country, through the federal provider. And they provided them everything. Look, they've got their notary stamps, they have their correct signatures, they even dated it within the appropriate amount of time before this could be presented. One of the steps that you have to do before you can complete the legalization is to go and make a specific payment into a specific account that's related to the bank of the province that you're in. So this client was not being represented by Outlier, and they came to request their document to be authenticated. So we went ahead and authenticated and legalized it. But what I'm learning through Outlier is that her lawyers are likely going to not be able to represent her with this document, and they're going to send her back and request another one. And that one would need to follow the steps like what Alfredo and Melissa were mentioning. So here we do have an example of one of those private letters that a client was able to procure, and it's been duly authenticated and legalized for use in Costa Rica. So it's written by the notary public in that province, who can speak to the authenticity of the letter that was written by the investment council that represents her. So instead of going through the pension department of Canada, she went through the investment council, had that letter created, and then had it notarized before we could authenticate and legalize it. So this is kind of the difference, and I'll show you the language. This made it usable, lifetime. This lifetime monthly pension. And that's what's missing in the Canadian provided documentation.
Okay. And that's important to know for people, that it really has to have, immigration they want things within their certain parameters, right? It has to tick the box, and that's the box they require is lifetime.
Right. And it makes sense because the expectation when people are able to come and be a resident here is that they won't be a burden on the social services that are available in Costa Rica. So I do understand why they have this rigid kind of requirement. And in most of our clients' cases, it's not that it's not lifetime. So they just need the language to be represented. It is usually lifetime in the cases of pensions. We just need to kind of play by their rules.
Right. Well, that's really good for people to know, because I think, you don't want to go through all that money and expense to get a document and then have it kicked back after you've waited, right?
And time.
And your immigration and time, yeah. You have to start all over.
You're talking about now you've got 6 more months, and you can't make certain decisions or make certain purchases in your name until that is finalized. So yeah, it can become a costly delay. So if we can, I'll switch to vital records, which no matter really what your category is, you will be requested to provide at least a background check and a vital record. So we'll look at a couple of examples of vital records. And this is where I'm so glad that Melissa is here and has been helping me with this learning curve. They're from Canada, and it's not been easy. So I'll show you a couple of examples, and then Melissa, I'll have you maybe share some of your experience with us. From what we have learned, there are several types of birth certificates that Canada issues. I'll show you an example one. This is the most common one that you might procure. This is made of sort of a plasticky paper, polymer, kind of like the new money that is being released in Costa Rica, if you're familiar with the new bills here. But it's a very durable, smaller page. It's not a full 8.5 by 11. It's maybe half or a quarter sheet even. Okay. And it's plasticky, and it's got sort of some transparency that you can see through. Here's a specimen document. This is just made up data so that we could see an example. And you can see that this is province specific. So in other countries, maybe it's the country that emits it. In the US, it's the state that emits the birth certificate. So in Canada, it's province specific, and this is going to play in later to some of our potential workarounds. So the issue that we're having with this type of birth certificate is that there's only one authority who can authenticate it. So when we talk about the authentication process not being part of the Hague and not being part of the apostille, that sounds like, well, we'll just go through the authentication route instead. But where the apostille process is one step, we procure the document, we send it to one entity, and then they send it back and it's ready. The authentication and legalization is between 3 and 4 steps. So for the example of the pension letter, right? You need it to be notarized, then we need to send it for authentication, then legalization in Canada, followed by legalization in Costa Rica. And that has to happen with all of the documents. So if you get your own pension letter, we can help with the notarization, the authentication, the legalization in both countries, and the shipment. These are things that individuals can do. And at the end of this call, we'll talk about the cost difference between hiring our service and what it might be to do it on your own, should you be the resourceful type. So if you bring a type of birth certificate like this one that is polymer, we can authenticate it, but it has to go through the Global Affairs of Canada, which is GAC. And this used to be just fine. We'd send it to GAC and carry about our 4-step process. But GAC has had and continues to have delays that were related and born out of COVID. So
Right.
there were offices that were closed, there were bridges that were closed, protests, you name it. Canada had a rough time with their closures and with COVID. So what we found is that this year, while last year GAC's turnaround time was 1 business day, it grew from 30 to 40 up to 75 plus.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So going back to what Alfredo said, it's a 6-month expiration date, best case scenario. And we're talking about now 4 months of that, it's sitting in the GAC. So we actually had a few clients whose documents died. They were dead on arrival. They had already expired by the time they got here. So we're definitely trying to avoid that. And we've pushed our providers. We've actually changed providers this year. We also have Melissa DiNardo in our back pocket. She's kind of stepping out of her typical role as account manager and becoming this documents guru. And so we're reaching everywhere that we can to help our Canadian clients and future Canadians who want to come to Costa Rica to make better of this situation. So when we ask, what's the major delay in Canada? There's 2 answers. One is they're not part of the Hague Convention, and so their process is multi-steps. And then the second answer is one of those steps, in most cases, is facing major delays. So I want to talk about the positives though, Debbie. I don't want to be a downer.
Oh yeah, I think though it's important for people to understand that. I
Yeah.
mean, just in the process, as you explain all the steps that need to be made, you know, my eyes kind of glazed over in the middle. It's like, oh my goodness, this is so many steps to do. And when you put it in the context of what the world has been through, right? We all are dealing, no matter where you live, right? You're dealing with, well, everything was at a standstill, and many things, are just not back. So even, in store shelves and things. And, it sounds like Canada, because of, a lot of other reasons that they had going on besides just, the pandemic, has really been in for it. And that's created a situation like, and with this, where you're trying to get documents where it's just a backlog and a difference in the process. And I don't even think people can even go in off the street into some of these offices.
I was just going to say, Debbie, it might not ever go back to the way that it was before, because there are walk-up windows in Canada and also in offices in the United States that are no longer accepting walk-ups, or phone numbers that they haven't accepted phone calls since 2020. And I don't see them going back. Actually, Melissa sent a friend like, hey, can you go see if they're there? And she waited for an hour and a half and sent her a picture and said, no, there's nobody. And there's a sticker on the door, like, scan me if you have a delivery.
So now that we know all the reasons that it's, and what's happened, and so people could understand, like, why is this delay happening? What have you guys learned that you can maybe work around, or some like creative problem solving and good news in this process?
Well, Melissa can maybe speak to some of the province specific things that she's learned, and I'll share one of the other types of birth certificates that certain Canadians might be able to use to their advantage.
Okay.
So one of the things that I have learned through investigation is only 2 provinces across Canada can actually speed up the process. Normally, if we're going to send in our vital documents that have already been notarized to the Global Affairs Consulate, it's going to take anywhere from the 45 to 65 business days. But if you live in British Columbia or in Ontario, you can go through a provincial office, but you have to jump through all of their hoops in order to make it actually accepted by the Costa Rican Immigration office in Costa Rica. So one of the things that we need to make sure is that they can't authenticate any birth certificate. And Amanda's going to talk about which ones we actually need to have, because Canadians have only over 4 styles. We have 4 styles of birth certificates. We don't make it easy. And if you don't order the right one, the whole thing gets denied. Also, through provincial offices, you have to pay a fee. If you go through global affairs, you don't, but you pay in time, and you actually have to pay in that juggle of will your document come back and still be like shelf life valid? Because if it's not, then you've made that whole gamble with time. Another thing that I kind of learned is that BC and Ontario operate completely different. So there's a certain protocol to go through the Ontario office, and then there's a different protocol to go through the British Columbia office. So it's not even the same between the provinces. And the only reason why these provinces are allowed to have this additional, I guess, privilege is because we have Costa Rican consulates in our province.
Oh,
So like Saskatchewan, Prince Edward Island, Alberta. I'm sorry, guys, but you guys don't have a like Costa Rica consulate, so you can't bring it to them to be legalized because they need to talk to each other. It's like a lot of process, and also the notary that you have notarized your document also needs to be part of the same province. If not, it has to be registered, or they have to be registered through the entire Canadian, I guess, global affairs consulate. So your like notary has to actually be registered in their system. So it just can't be any notary or any notarized lawyer unless they jump through these hoops and they're acknowledged.
okay. And so are all the notaries that are required for this process are attorneys, correct?
Yes, they're notarized attorneys. And even though they're part of the notary bar, they're not registered through the global affairs consulate or the provincial offices. So those notary lawyers actually have to submit paperwork before their notary is even accepted as a signature.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a clarification. We've talked that there are a few different varieties of birth certificates. The only ones that are acceptable in in Costa Rican immigration are the ones that are considered long form. And what makes it long form and what makes it acceptable in Costa Rica is that it has the parents' first and last names, their complete names. And the short form doesn't. And that's why we need to make sure that when they're procuring it, if they're going through the province, for example, they make sure that they get the cream colored one and not the green colored one. So the cream colored one that I'm showing now is the correct one if you are from Ontario. Something important to note is to make sure that it does have the parents' last names, first names, and this stamp at the bottom. And you'll notice that behind this stamp, there is a raised stamp. And that there makes it official so that it can be authenticated at the province level.
It's a registered live.
A quick question though for me is that, but on the ones that use the, I guess, polymer, I'm going to use polymer type, are all of those long form or some of those short form and long form? Is there some differentiation that people need to understand with that?
Yes, the ones that are the polymer are about a letter size, and the long form is actually a legal sized paper document.
Okay.
It's 11 by 14. And then they also get small ones that are laminated, and then another one that's like about 3 by 5. So they have all these different ones, but you have to make sure it's the registered live birth cream colored long form birth certificate from your province.
So is that cream colored one of the polymer ones or not one of the polymer ones?
No.
Okay, so the polymer one, it's just whatever the polymer one is going to be okay.
At the GAC, the Global Affairs Consulate.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So let's run an example. Let's say I'm from Saskatchewan, and so these workarounds with Ontario and British Columbia aren't going to apply to me.
It's not going to work. Yeah.
Right. I need to get a long form polymer birth certificate, and I need to make sure that it has my parents' complete names on it. If I have that, then we can help with authentication. You can also jump through the hoops and go through the authentication if that's what you prefer. And we'll talk about the cost differences in a little bit. The cost is not a lot once you start seeing all the costs that's actually associated with the process and not with hiring our services. Especially for anybody who's in Costa Rica already, it's really advisable to hire somebody to help with it. I have had a client who just decided like, I'm going back to Canada anyway. And so she went ahead and she stood in the lines and she got her own RCMP and she was able to get it back. So I won't stand here and say that Canadians have to hire us, but I will say that if you do not want to go stand in the lines and run through the hoops and or make the mistakes, like what our client did with the pension letter, right? She did all the work and it didn't say that one word. And so it's not accepted through immigration. So those are kind of just, besides painting you guys the reality of what is getting Canadian documents, I think that hiring our service is a pretty good idea for any of the Canadians.
Also, if you miss any one of the hoops, so if you miss one tiny process, one small notary, one stamp, it's not done in the proper order, and you submit that document, immigrations, once they review it, they'll give you, is it 10 days, Alfredo?
Yeah.
They give you like 10 days notice to get this document submitted to them. So if you go through all of this and you've submitted the wrong documents and then you don't submit the right document on time, then you could be denied.
And it took you all that time to get them. Everybody knows that you're not going to get anything to correct it in 10 days, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I wanted alone to Costa Rica is about 5 days expedited.
Oh yeah, overnight, even overnight is 3 days from the States to Costa, even to Europe. It's not really overnight. They say it's overnight. You pay for overnight, but it's like 3 days. So and Alfredo, are there any other things we talked a little bit, and maybe you could tell people because it was touched on just a scooch, as far as this 6 months, can Canadians also use, if they're in good shape, their original birth certificates, or do they have to first get a copy, a new copy to have it authenticated in that?
Well, immigration actually issued a resolution a while ago. I don't remember the exact date when it was, but due to all this COVID thing, basically they just started accepting just birth certificates that were actually longer than the 6 months of issuance from the date that it was issued. I'm sorry. So that's the only actual document that can be used, even if they are from, let's say, 4 years ago. If they are in good shape, good condition, doesn't have any stains or something, and it has like the same name as in the passport, or if it doesn't, because due to a name change or something, if they actually file the name change documents, that can also be used. But regarding the marriage and the background check certificates, those must be within the 6 months of issuance. Otherwise, they won't be accepted. And just to add, one actually loop that is on the law regarding all this short form and long form birth certificates is that short forms are actually can be used for the immigration process without the parents' information. The only thing is that the person must do an affidavit so that with the parents' information on it, and that will be accepted by immigration. So from the legal part, I can say this. From the documents part, I don't know if this actually changed timelines or something, because I really do not know. But there is a little loop in the law that actually qualifies you or give you the availability to actually file a short form, do an affidavit, and file it. This is a little bit more expensive due to the affidavit cost and everything, but there is that little loop that I would like to jump in and
say. It would seem, though, I don't know, maybe Amanda, you can jump in here because you guys would know this, but just by hearing that, it almost would seem, because the cost and the time involved in the affidavit, that you could just go ahead and get a new birth certificate. I mean, wouldn't that just be, isn't that really the easier solution?
In most cases, we do suggest just getting a new birth certificate. Yeah, if that's a possibility. Now, there's some cases where maybe they have a copy and they're like, no, I already have a copy. I want to use this one. It's okay.
Yeah.
And this is your option. I don't have the prices off the top of my head of procuring a new one, but I'm almost positive none of the provinces cost $150. So it's probably
Right.
cheaper to get a new one.
Right, cheaper to get a new one. And Alfredo, there's a little bit of a, can you talk a little bit about the RCMP background check? Like how recent is, that has to be within 6 months too, but is it 6 months from the authentication or is it 6 months from, like, how does that work?
Okay, yeah, every document is 6 months from the date that it was actually issued. It doesn't matter when it was authenticated or legalized in this case. It is from the day that the actual document was issued. You have 6 months to actually file it.
With the exception of RCMPs, because RCMPs have a date that they were issued by the RCMP, right? But on the RCMP itself, it also has a line that says the date that the fingerprints were taken. And that is the date at which the 6 month clock begins, or in the case of citizens, the 3 month clock begins. And so if we're talking about GAC holding on to your RCMP for 75 plus business days, that doesn't look good for your 3 month turnaround time.
No.
So that's really where we started noticing was with a client who was going through citizenship, and we kept getting the RCMP, but it was already expired. And so, yes, Alfredo, thank you for that. All the other documents that I have used through my time here at the company just say the issuance date, but RCMPs are from the date that the fingerprints were taken.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. That really, how are people going to get everything together in 6 months? How are you guys doing that? What's the plan for that?
So it's possible. Again, the RCMP does not have to be authenticated through GAC. So we're using other resources to be able to expedite that step. So one thing that we kind of usually lump together is, authentication and legalization, but those are actually two different things done by two different entities. So the GAC is responsible for authenticating that the document is real. Or the notary also has that responsibility in the case of the pension letter. They authenticate that it's real and hasn't been altered. But in the case of the RCMPs, the authentication step doesn't have to come through the GAC. There are other provincial level entities who do communicate with the RCMP and who can authenticate that. So for example, instead of going through GAC, we were working recently with a provider who goes through ODS, which is called Official Document Services. They can authenticate RCMPs much quicker. Generally, it's taking a number of weeks instead of a number of months. We're still seeing that the GAC is getting some more things out. According to their website, they're down to 45 business days. According to our notes, it's still around 60, but it does seem to be kind of calming down a little bit with the GAC. But I believe that is probably because people like us are starting to go through these other avenues.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about asking everybody on the call a question just to see, has anybody here already gone and tried to gather their documents themselves? I was just kind of curious about that. I certainly, in the States, I'm from the US, and in the US, it's a much simpler process because we're part of the Hague. It's essentially, a two-step tango, not all these multi-steps, right? And it is, difficult enough for some people to do that. This just, this is way over my head, I think, if, especially if I wasn't even in Canada. I don't know, just the shipping back and forth for these things. And I don't see how you could really have a family member help you with this if you were out of the country, because of the time frames. You're going to really have to be on the time frame to get these documents turned around as they sit and they just kind of, as you say, die. They just expire.
It's not impossible. I did have a client who worked with a parent who was already retired themselves to gather some documents, but the issue was that it took them a long time. And so the client shared with me, they're like, well, how can I complain to my mom? She's doing me a favor. You know, this is taking forever. And I said, you're right. So what we did in her case was we provided our providers Canadian address, and they were able to ship it directly to the Canadian address, which saved on time and shipping as well. So we do have a couple of Canadians in our pockets. When you are procuring something, if you want to just go ahead and hire us on for the authentication and legalization, de una vez, as we say in Spanish, right at that moment, then we can just work with you to ship it directly to our Canadian provider and not have to ship it to Costa Rica and then ship it back and ship it back.
Right. Oh.
And you know, shipping has continued to increase
Oh my
all
gosh.
year. What used to cost, say, $60 is now like $98 when it comes to shipping a package that costs less than 1 pound or 1 kilo, whatever units they're using, which documents don't weigh a lot. So you're thinking like, oh, that should be pretty cheap. No, it is not. Shipping is crazy.
It's crazy. Just, you know, just for kind of a point of reference for folks, back, you know, we ended up being in Costa Rica during the pandemic because we kind of got stuck there, but that was a great place to be stuck, right? But we did our ballots, right, for the presidential election. It cost $75.
I mean, at some point you're like, we can just get on the plane and take it, we'll hand it to them.
Yeah, $75. Now we did send them together, so you know that was a little bit of a savings. We didn't, you know, but the stuff has gone up and it's super expensive. Even within the States, what used to be, you know, a FedEx overnight letter at $11 is now, you know, to send something from Cincinnati to Florida is what, $37, $50, and some of that is like, that's like 3 days. It's not even overnight. So, you know, everything has increased. But when you were talking, something that kind of ran across my mind, I was curious about, it seems like there's a lot of things that people have to pay for that have nothing to do with someone providing the service of actually helping get the documents. So like the postage, the government fee. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because it almost sounds to me like once you take that out, the getting your document isn't that much of the price as it seems. Does that make sense, my question?
Absolutely, yes.
So when you actually think about all of the costs and you've shipped it to the notary, you've shipped it to the provincial or the GAC, you have to include the postage in your application to get your letter, like your documents authenticated. And then you have to send it then to the Costa Rican consulate. And then you have to send it back to Costa Rica so that they can take it to get legalized in Costa Rica. It costs about over $455 just for the RCMP. After everything that you've done, that's how much you'll spend on your own.
Wow.
And like we, OLS Docs, you guys charge $600 for an RCMP. So that's about what, $145 difference, but you're saving in your time and in your headaches. Like you have to do all the research on where to send it, how to send it. And they have such specific specifications on each application and how they receive these packages. If you're not doing it properly, they won't even process it and they'll just return it back to you.
Oh my word. I can't
imagine.
I mean, oh my
best case scenario, they send it back to you, right? Often it's just like, well, that didn't comply, so it's gone.
Well, while you're talking, you know what's running through my head? Have you ever seen those road maps, or where they're, I think of like a Saturday Night Live sketch, you know, where they're traveling and then they put the map up and it's like this spaghetti of all the ways they've gone around. I kind of feel like that's what I'm hearing. Like you go here and then you go there and then you have to put the super special stamp on it here and then you have to go to some other random bank and give them this money. I'm like,
even just one step in the process, the very last step, and honestly the simplest step, which is when we take it to the last step of legalization here in Costa Rica. It's at the place called La Casa Amarilla. If you guys are
Right.
familiar with Costa Rica, you've heard of it. It's the ministry to the foreign affairs. And so you take your foreign documents there and they provide this final stamp. Just to do that step, it requires several people on our team. And so we ship it, right, internationally, and we have somebody receive it here at the office. And then,
Okay.
and it's actually Gia who's here as chat support. Gia receives this document hot off the press, right? It's got all the other stamps on it. And he has to schedule an appointment with the Casa Amarilla. To schedule an appointment with the Casa Amarilla, you have to have a cédula from Costa Rica. So you definitely need somebody who's local who can make that appointment for you. But that's okay. Let's say you have a friend and you can make the appointment. Okay, so you've made your appointment at the Casa Amarilla. They're only available in windows of 2 days out. So you have to have your document and then make your appointment for an appointment in the next 2 days. They are like 15-minute appointments. They're downtown. So when our team goes, we have to pay for parking downtown and hop in our line and we go. You also have to buy a little stamp that's called a timbre. And you, what Gia does is he applies like a glue stick on the back of our application paper, applies the timbre, and then it's ready to be submitted. So I show up with this paper ready, and they go and they provide a signature and a stamp while I'm watching, and they stamp it, and now your paper is ready to go. And that was just one step. So every single step is like that, and it's at a different place. And you know, the 3 steps are in Canada, and the last one is here in Costa Rica. So you know how governments are and how they necessarily don't want to make these kinds of processes simple. So it's just very bureaucratic, and
Yeah.
that's what we're here for.
It seems
Yeah.
like everybody wants to have their own stamp.
Oh my gosh, right? And they're like, well, I have a stamp here. And no, the poor
Stamp?
girls and guys at Casa Amarilla, they have 2 stamps, a signature, and on each page. So it's like they're, you know, yeah.
And
over.
these are actual stamps, aren't they?
Rubber stamps, like stud
Yeah.
stamps. Yes, some
Yeah.
of them are raised. In Canada, they have raised stamps, so they push through the paper a bit.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It doesn't sound simple. It doesn't sound simple to me. And you know, I mean, good on them if somebody wants to go through all of that. But boy, it's really great that, you know, to have a company. And I think, isn't OLS Documents kind of like pretty much the only company in Costa Rica that can do this for expats if they want help with fingerprints and documents and things like that? Aren't you guys kind of the standard operating procedure place to go in Costa Rica?
I was just talking with one of our CEOs today, and they have realized that there are a few other law firms who have grown their document services and that are offering. I think that they're a little bit new to the game, and
Right.
where we stand out is that we have not only our experience with documents over the last 4 or 5 years that we've been our own standalone company, but we also have people like Alfredo who know all about Costa Rican immigration, and people like Melissa who are physically in Canada and know all about the Canadian documents.
Right.
So
That
yes, they
makes-
might be able to find some other services, but I personally wouldn't consider that a competition with our service because of the experience and the expertise that we have on our team.
Right. I agree with that. I mean, I think most people would say that you know, especially with something like this, that sounds to be so fraught with denial, you know, like you do all these steps and then you're not really sure, you know, that it even is okay. And then you get denied. You know, myself, I'd rather go with someone who's done it, you know, many, many, many times than someone that just added it. Kind of like, you know, do you want, you know, if you're gonna, do you want somebody who's been a doctor a long time or somebody that just got out of school, right, to do your particular surgery?
And this is our
Kind of thing.
focus, like you said at the beginning of the
That's
call,
all you
it's
do.
all documents all the time. This is all we do. I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to know immigration law or real estate or any of that. So I'm just super hyper focused on documents, and our whole team is ready to just hand it off to the next person who's also hyper focused on the same thing.
Yeah,
So.
it reminds me a little bit. I have some friends that this has been several years ago, and they had decided to do their residency application on their own. And I met with them, because that was long before I was doing anything with Outlier, and that I've been talking to Outlier for a long time. And I met with them, and they went through all the things that they did with their to do their residency application. How many nights they had to go to San Jose, that they hired these simultaneous translators. I mean, it was, you know, my about halfway like this through the conversation, my eyes glazed over. And they're very sweet to meet with us and tell us everything. My husband and I hadn't gotten, you know, 20 steps away from visiting with them, and we just looked at each other like, you know, we're going to hire Outlier. And the most interesting part of that story is that, you know, fast forward about a year, a little bit over a year, they had to start all over. They hired Outlier because they hadn't, even though they spent all the same money as we ended up spending on our residency, they had to start over because they had messed it up, you know. And so this sounds like the same risk to me. So they essentially paid double. And nobody wants to do that. You know, nobody.
First time, or you can
Yeah.
pay double or triple to like
Absolutely.
You're on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Alfredo, I'm kind of curious, asking you, you know, what's one of the main reasons, or what are the main reasons that people get denied? I mean, you're the one on that side of the fence, right? So you see the denial letters.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately I am, but yeah. Well, basically, at least just to stick to the topic of today's webinar, most denials that we receive due to documents basically is just because people actually don't pay attention on this, the validity of the documents. Basically, they actually go and file everything already expired, or they thought that they would have more time, or they didn't catch the actual issuance date and they thought that it was based on the legalization date. So all these issues that people do not usually know, because they actually do not need to know this. But yeah, basically that is the main reasons that we actually received denials due to this documentation.
Right. Yes, I kind of thought it might be that, because that's kind of the hoop and the biggest responsibility when you're gathering things yourself, is to, you know, make sure that the same reason why that you get an accountant to help you with your taxes, you know, so you don't miss your tax day. So I think, is there anything else, Amanda or Melissa, that you can think of I didn't ask you, or we forgot to talk about, that you want to make sure that you make sure everybody
I'm just
knows?
checking my notes right now to make sure we
Yeah.
talked on it.
Yeah, I think we did, at least based on what I was thinking and what we talked about before. And I think really the take-home message that you want people to understand is, whether they're doing it on their own or they hire someone else to do it for them, that it is not going to be a short process. And it's really going to, I mean, to me, it sounds like you're going to have all your patience to, all your patience and then some more, to actually, get the documents you need so that you can be successful with your immigration. And how lucky to have a team of people available, to help and do that for you.
Yeah, I would say it's just an opportunity to work smarter and not harder. I know many people who are ready to experience the pura vida that we have to offer here are not trying to go stand in lines and jump through hoops and all of that. After breaking down the price cost with Melissa and seeing that it's $100, $150 or so for having the peace of mind and the ability to step away and to have that time to worry about other things like moving to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Or retiring or opening your business or whatever it is that is calling for you. That's your focus, and this can be ours. And the reason that we don't have too large, honestly, of a markup on these documents is because we're aware of how expensive these things are for the Canadians who are immigrating. Because compared to other immigrants' costs, the paperwork for Canadians costs more. And so we have come down on our profit margin, if you will, on our markup for Canadians to try to help offset some of that, because they see the bills, there's 4 people in their family and they all need these documents, and they just feel like, I should do it on my own, because they see this number. And so I just want to caution people who are considering to do it on their own that these realities are out there, and then encourage the people who might be on the fence to, should I hire these guys or these new guys who I see are on the market, maybe who have a cheaper price. I would recommend sticking with us. We've learned a lot, and actually Melissa continues to make phone calls and connections with people who are in those two friendly, let's say, provinces, but as well as for the other provinces who do not have consulates, to see like how, okay, if we can't do it this way, how can we do it that way? That's kind of the mentality of the Outlier philosophy anyways, is like, you can't tell me no. I'm just going to figure out how we're going to make it happen, because it's gonna, we're going to make it happen. And Alfredo's the same way with immigration. And Melissa's the same way with her research in this as well. It's been like, well, I don't know everything yet, but I know enough to be helpful to the Canadians who want to come and join.
Right. You're going to find I think, as we say, at least a saying that we say is, you're going to MacGyver it. You're going to find a way.
We're going to find a way, and we're going to push it through.
You're going to find a way. And so if people, you're very reachable, right? They can email you, they can call. You have your own website, right? And
that's
so
right.
they
OLS
can
Documents.
ask questions.
Yeah, OLS Documents is, I like to look at it as kind of like a little sister of Outlier. So we do share a lot of resources. You can always reach out to the people who you know through Outlier, your first contacts there. But we have our own staff, we have our own website, we have our own domain. So you might be used to seeing people at outlierlegal.com. Our domain is olsdocuments.com. So that's our website. That's going to be our email addresses if you see us coming through. If you also follow on social media, we share information, and if we are to have any promotions, that would be where to follow us there. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, and we're on LinkedIn. And that's where you can find OLS Docs, in addition to checking out Outlier. And Outlier Legal also posts lots of information. I highly recommend checking out their blog section. It's just blowing up lately. And they are accurate. Whereas online, you might find any information that you're looking for is out there, but how accurate it is sometimes is questionable. So I like to recommend that resource too.
Absolutely. And that's really important, because sometimes some of the information you see on the internet, I see people asking questions all the time. We always say, people, if you have a headache, you get on Dr. Google to make sure that you don't have cancer, right? Well, it's the same kind of idea that people use Facebook, right? They're trying to use Facebook for their legal help. And it's like, guys, this is like, you really should, talk to an attorney about that,
Yes, exactly.
I wanted to ask Alfredo just real quick. So if with how this process works, if somebody's retained Outlier on the legal side, their case manager will actually talk to them to make sure what documents they may need help with, right? Or how they're going to do it.
Yes, exactly. Once they actually engage to work with us, basically we assign an immigration service coordinator. That is basically their main point of contact with Outlier. They will be actually guiding through the whole process. They will be telling them which documents they actually need, how they can procure the documentation. They will be doing follow-ups with immigration also, and they will keep in touch basically every time the client needs, either by email or by phone, however the client actually prefers to do so. They will be there just one click or one phone away.
We will have our webinars also on our YouTube channel. And we would really love it if you would go to the YouTube channel and give us, of course, a thumbs up, so that we can bring you more content. And if you have any questions, you can always ask us either through, we have so many ways. Outlier has so many ways, through Facebook or email or whatever. And also OLS Docs has the same venues for you to be able to ask questions. But also, you know, as everyone I think uses YouTube knows, there's also places on those YouTube videos to comment. You know, tell us what other kind of webinars you'd like to see. Tell us what kind of questions that you need the answers to. And we will do our very best to bring you those answers and bring all the experts together that know all the information, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that expats can live their dream. And that's how we work every day, is to make that happen. Thank you so much for coming again, and Pura Vida.